Julie Rose, and this is Top of Mind. I have been a radio journalist for 2 decades, but a few years ago, I found myself avoiding the news for long stretches because of how depressing and divisive it all seems. I still wanted to be informed and engaged on important issues, though, and I figured I couldn't be alone in that. So we created this podcast. Each week, we tackle one tough topic in a way that will challenge you, help you feel more empathy, and empower you to become a better citizen, a kinder neighbor, and a more effective advocate. Today, Stick With It moments from Season 4. We've spent the last several months here on Top of Mind assessing the assumptions that drive our decisions. And along the way, I hope you've had more than a few stick with it moments where you've heard a perspective that challenged you, but you chose to keep listening, to stay open and curious, to stick with the discomfort long enough to be glad that you did, because maybe you felt some new empathy or gained some new clarity. I'd love to hear about it. You can email topofmind@byu.edu. And hopefully those experiences have been good practice for sticking with it when you encounter challenging perspectives in your daily life. Because that is how we become better citizens, kinder neighbors, and more effective advocates, which, as you know, is our goal on the podcast. So today, the Top of Mind team is reflecting on stick with it moments that we had while working on Season 4.
Hello, my name is Samuel Benson, and I've been producing on the Top of Mind team for about a year now.
It's great to have you, Samuel. Thanks for coming in.
Thanks.
So what episode during the season brought you a stick with it moment?
Yeah, so my stick with it moment was from actually the very first episode of the season, of Season 4, which was about this, whether living longer can conflict with dying well, sort of this idea about extending life at any cost. So
this one grappled a lot with end-of-life decisions and what it means to die well. What caused you to feel uncomfortable, that kind of forced this stick with it moment for you?
Yeah, so often when we talk about these stick with it moments, it's often like an idea that maybe we disagreed with or brought us some discomfort. But in this case, I didn't, disagree with anything the guests were saying. What was hard for me and what brought this discomfort was the general concept of death, right? I have always, since I was very, very young, grappled with this pretty intense fear, of death and of life ending. And so when I saw that this was sort of one of the ideas we wanted to work on, and the conversation came up, it was hard. I was hesitant because I knew that I'd have to prepare myself and set myself up for dealing with a lot of thoughts that are hard for me to grapple with, and with a lot of feelings that make me, for lack of better words, scared and afraid and uncomfortable. So,
well, and which is, of course, understandable.
Of course,
a lot of us are uncomfortable with in fact, that was one of the kind of key themes of the episode.
Exactly,
was if we could get more comfortable with thinking about, anticipating, planning, discussing, whatever, what we want our deaths to be like, that we might actually be able to have better deaths, for lack of a better way to say it. But so I appreciate you sharing that, and
of course,
and I guess, as you were mentioning, in this case, then your a stick with it moment always includes sort of a gut reaction to bail out or get defensive, and in this case, it sounds like it was to sort of shut it off, to say, unfortunately for you, you're a producer, you're in the room, you couldn't just bail out, but you could certainly have disengaged from those conversations or sort of tried to put a wall up and not think deeply about them.
Yeah, definitely. And you are right. Obviously, it's part of my job to be in the room. So it's not like I could just choose, like I've done throughout my life when these types of conversations start to happen or come up naturally, where I would often just make an excuse and excuse myself and leave the room or whatever.
Yeah.
But since that wasn't the case, there wasn't maybe this feeling inside of me of being like, okay, well then I can't physically leave, so maybe I will mentally leave, so to speak, or, dissociate or disengage from this just so I don't have to think deeply about it, or I don't have to face these feelings or cause myself to have them in the first place, because I don't know what will happen if I do that,
So what was the decision that you made instead?
What happened for me was hearing, I think in the episode, there's clips from David Oliver, right? And of these videos he made as he was coming towards the end of his life and the decisions they were making. And
around his cancer treatment.
Yeah.
Hello, I'm David Oliver, and this is video number 12 in our series about my cancer journey. This one we're calling Cancer, My Exit Strategy. I've developed an acronym for it. It spells HOPE, so it's pretty easy to remember. The H stands for home. I want to die at home. The O stands for others. I want to be surrounded by others, family and friends, and, as far as I'm concerned, anybody can walk in. P is for pain. Actually, pain management. I do not want to suffer. And in this day and age, I don't think you should have to suffer with cancer. And the E stands for excitement. I still want to be excited about living. I hope people want to come visit, and they will come into a house full of, fun and not depression.
Hearing him sort of speak with such, I don't know, such hope and such optimism, because he had taken control, even though there was a lack of control in terms of he didn't choose to have cancer, obviously, and couldn't make those choices, but he was able to take control of the things that mattered the most to him, which was to, make sure he was surrounded by family, to make sure that he lived the most life he could. It really changed my perspective about if we can think about death more in the idea of thinking about life first, right? Because if we spend all of our time, and he could have spent all of his time just wallowing and being depressed that, this is, I only have this much time left. He chose to change his perception of it, about, okay, well then how much life can I live still? I'm not going to waste that. And that was helpful for me to know that, okay, I don't have to, if I spend all of my life, I spend all my time disengaging from death and not thinking about it, will I, when it happens to everyone, like we say in the episode, it's inevitable. If I don't want to get to that point, having spent all of my life ignoring it and then not being prepared and not being in a place where I can, if I end up in a situation like David Oliver did, where I'm like, now suddenly I have to confront this and I spent my whole life trying to run away from it, that's going to make it, that much worse if I don't change my mindset.
Yeah. So thanks for sharing that, Samuel. I a couple of things stand out to me. So we think about a stick with it experience as sort of feeling an instinct to back away, to shut it down, making the choice instead to stay open and curious or humble or whatever the case may be, which was, in your case, being willing to listen and be in the room and not disengage from the conversations that we were having as a team, as well as the conversations that ultimately played out in the course of the episode. Of course, which I can imagine there are a lot of people who would see an episode titled, When Living Longer Conflicts with Dying Well, and they're like, oh, good, no thank you. I'm not in a place right now to be thinking about death. And of course, that's an individual choice for a lot of us. But that was one of the things that I certainly came away from that episode as well, realizing, the more comfortable I can be thinking about, discussing, planning for death, the better I can live and make sure that my life is that I maximize my opportunity to live. So it's interesting that for you, the payoff, and oftentimes with Stick With It, the staying open and the curious leads either to some sort of aha moment, or maybe just I never thought of it that way. shifting the lens to where it wasn't actually an episode about death for you. It was an episode about living.
Yeah. And honestly, I think I've been able to have since then more conversations about it and be more open. And it just so happened that at the time we were developing this episode, that my grandfather, my paternal grandfather, ended up going into hospice care, and we weren't sure how much time he had left. And so these types of conversations became a lot more common among my family and people like that. And I was grateful that I had sort of this moment to prepare myself, that I had gotten to a better place, because it would have been really hard to disengage from those. And even though I'm pretty young, so I'm hopefully not worrying about the end of my life at this point too much. My wife and I have been able to have conversations just, in passing about how we would want to approach a situation like that. And it's brought me some peace, because I think fear often just comes from, and anxiety can come from feeling a lack of control or a lack of knowing what's coming. And I've been able to take a little bit of that back, what I can in my life. So
yeah. Thanks for sharing, Samuel. I appreciate it.
Yeah, of course.
I'm Elena Beck. I'm from Boise, Idaho, and I've been at Top of Mind for about 5 months.
What drew you to the job?
I really love the variety of subjects that we address and how expansive the world has become to me as I've been interacting with new people all the time.
So what was your stick with it experience in this last season?
My stick with it moment came as I was working on the Fines episode 10 of this season, and simultaneously the immigration episode. The Fines episode was looking at how we motivate people through money and how fines can act as incentives, but also looking at the unintended consequences when we motivate people with money and how that isn't always as effective as we think it is. The immigration episode was looking at immigration through a new lens, not just about permanency and the American identity of who needs to be here or should be here, but about the American labor shortage and how we can or shouldn't maybe help our labor shortage with temporary visa workers.
So what was challenging for you?
Yes, so I was working on them kind of simultaneously. I was looking at Yuri Gneezy's studies and what he had to say about fines and incentives, and I thought it was really interesting. I thought it was cool for sure, but I didn't really see how it fit in with the rest of the episode and why we were including it when we're talking about Lisa Foster's work, and they did not seem comparable or to match for me, but it wasn't a big deal. Yeah. It just didn't make sense.
Okay, so this is an episode listeners might recall where we talk extensively about fines in the criminal justice system and how those can have harmful effects in a lot of cases or unintended consequences. But then we do end the episode with a conversation with a behavioral economist who's sort of trying to unpick for us the ways in which fines can backfire sometimes and actually encourage the behavior you're trying to deter. So it seemed to you were kind of like, I don't know what this guy has much to do with anything. It didn't feel very engaging to you.
Exactly. He was just talking about daycares, his child's daycare, and also just school districts fining parents for pulling their kids out of school early. I was like, okay, that's fine. But okay.
So if a stick with it experience is one where at a certain point you want to, disengage because you feel like it's either irrelevant to you, was your feeling in this case. It wasn't necessarily making you angry. Okay.
Yeah, it was just fine. It was there.
But this connects then for you to the next episode in the season, which was about immigration and the job market.
Exactly. So I was at the same time also working on the immigration episode, and I was looking at Oren Cass.
And Oren Cass is an economic policy analyst with a conservative organization called American Compass. They're a conservative think tank. And so was there a specific part of his position that was challenging for you?
Yes. So when he was talking about wanting to do away with all temporary visa worker programs. That seemed extreme to me.
So here's that exchange then from the interview as well as the episode where Oren Cass explains his position on that. With a secure border, would you like to also see fewer immigrants overall coming into the United States legally?
So if we could actually enforce our immigration laws effectively, I think a very important thing to then do is to phase down and ultimately out these temporary worker programs.
To have them completely go away.
Correct. I don't think there's any economic rationale for having the kinds of temporary visa programs, either for low-skilled or high-skilled workers, that we have today.
Okay, Elena, so this triggered a stick-with-it moment for you. What was your reaction? What was your inclination in hearing his position on guest worker programs?
Yeah, there was a lot of resistance. I felt myself pulling away, all the feelings that we've all experienced before when we hear something we don't like or we directly disagree with. I definitely identified more with what Rebecca Smith and Lamp Pritchett were saying in the episode. I didn't understand how you could think there was a reason to deny people the opportunity to come work in America when it would be so beneficial to them and they didn't have that opportunity where they were born, which is not something that they can control. And then there was a moment when I was talking with a friend and she was just casually asking me about work and what I was working on. And so I was talking about these 2 episodes that I was working on, Fines and Immigration. And as I was talking about it, just explaining the ideas and concepts and the perspectives we were trying to present, they started connecting in my mind and I started seeing them differently. So Yuri Ganezi talks about incentives and how we try to incentivize people through fines, but it often backfires and creates the motivation for people to do the opposite of what the incentive is trying to do. And then Oren Cass was also talking about the same thing, I realized, that when we are giving businesses in America the opportunity to get cheap labor so easily through temporary visa workers, that we are incentivizing them to not become efficient, to not want to make progress and do more with what they already have.
Right.
And so
Which was his core argument that what we really need is more productivity in America.
Yes.
It's why we have a free market system. And so why would we want to undercut that incentive by allowing access to unlimited temporary guest work?
Exactly.
Yeah, interesting. So those 2 things all of a sudden connected along the lines of incentives for you.
Yeah, I was like, oh, Oren Cass, while he's talking about immigration, it's not necessarily immigration. It's more about incentives and how, as an economist, he was worried about the incentives we were giving businesses in America. And as these ideas connected in my mind and as I was just like speaking out loud with my friend, I realized that I could understand Oren Cass better. And while my perspective didn't immediately change to match his, or I could totally see and agree with him now, I did understand him better, and I was glad that I had the opportunity to carry through and stick with it and to see his perspective better.
Yeah. So for you, what was the payoff there?
I feel like I now have this experience in my pocket that I can apply to other situations. When I have a situation where I'm directly disagreeing with somebody, I can think Oren Cass and be like, you are not always right and you do not always know everything of this perspective and you can't understand them completely until you hear them entirely.
Yeah. Yeah, that's. Thank you for sharing that, Elena. That's really cool. It's also kind of, I'm thinking about this idea that you, in order to feel like you were able to engage more sincerely, I guess, with the ideas that Oren Cass was putting forward, you had to look at it from a different perspective. Look at it not just as a we want to keep immigrants out. It wasn't a question of who deserves to be here and whether or not it's good for them. He was taking a very specific lens that has to do with America's economy and what's good for America. And as we point out in the episode, there are lots of different lenses we could look at this through. But if we insist upon looking at it only through one lens, then we're missing a lot of other possibilities that might lead us to a place where we can make more informed decision. And so it was for you, it was a switch of realizing like, oh, well, I'm looking at it from this side and he's looking at it from this side. And I can see how it's rational.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, exactly. Without having both of those episodes happening at the same time, I don't think I would have been able to see his perspective as well.
Interesting. Yeah. Well, Elena, thank you so much for your work on both of those episodes and also for sharing this story with us. It's the kind of thing that I really hope listeners experience as well.
Yes, of course. I'm happy to be here.
Did that episode on immigration and the labor market present you with any stick with it moments? If so, let us know. Our email is topofmind@byu.edu. We love to hear how the conversations we're having on the podcast strike you. Like this review that we got on Apple Podcasts recently from Sharon in MO. The listener says, I absolutely love Top of Mind. It is helping me to expand my mind and thought process by considering many ways to look at one issue. Well, if you are inclined to leave us a review on Apple Podcasts, we would love to read it. It also helps the algorithm recommend Top of Mind to new listeners who are also looking to expand their minds and consider new ways of seeing things. Let's get back now to the stick with it stories that our team is sharing as we look back on season 4.
My name is Vanessa Goodman. I'm from Springville, Utah, and I've been working at Top of Mind for over a year now.
What brought you a stick with it moment this season, Vanessa?
It was during my time working on episode 2 about adoption. Working on this episode was personal to me from the beginning because my dad was adopted from Guatemala when he was a baby. And so it's always been something I've known about, something I've been aware of, something part of my family. It's always like a super celebratory story that we tell in our family of how he came to be with my grandparents and his siblings and kind of just the happy ending of his adoption story. So I've always thought of it as a super positive thing. You know, if he hadn't been adopted, then he wouldn't have been able to meet my mom and I wouldn't have been born. So it's an essential part of who I am.
And so the root then of your discomfort was the notion that we would need to look for, and that you, as a producer on this episode, would need to go out looking for perspectives that might challenge that story in some way. Or complicate the narrative.
Yeah, and even when I first started working on it, I told my dad, I was like, hey, I'm working on research for an adoption episode we might do. And he's like, oh, are you going to find a bunch of people who hate adoption or wish they were never adopted? Like, I don't want to hear that. And I was like, oh, well, maybe. I don't know. And I wasn't really interested in looking for those things either, but I knew part of the job kind of had to.
Yeah. Okay. So, and of course we go out and we look for lots of things, but we're not looking only for one specific thing.
Yeah.
But it was part of the job, like you mentioned. And so did you have a light bulb moment?
Yeah. So at first when I was looking for differing perspectives, I ran into a bunch of super negative things like we should outlaw adoption. It should not be a thing that happens at all, or just horror stories of people that had terrible adoptions and they wish they'd never been adopted. And so that was hard for me because I was like, I don't want to listen to those kind of things. I don't want to seem like I'm encouraging this kind of idea by presenting it even as an option. But I knew that to do right by the story, I had to dig a little bit into the complexities of it. When I started to find perspectives more in the middle of maybe adoption's good, but we can't ignore that it is hard, or the trauma that comes with adoption sometimes, or, well, all the time, actually, as we discovered through the episode. I feel like that was when I started to become a lot more enjoyable to me, I guess. It became a lot more enjoyable to me.
Right. So you had I hadn't really thought of it from that perspective kind of moment, which often happens with stick with it. I mean, there was the key point here of deciding that you were going to stay open, even though it was very uncomfortable to you, to sort of be open to those possible perspectives. And in the process, discover that there were really complex perspectives that weren't necessarily all yes or all no, but what was it about some of those perspectives, or was there a particular perspective that you heard as we were doing the interviews for this episode that really started to kind of make you glad that you had stayed open?
I think it was less of a discovery of these different perspectives, more of a realization and putting a name to things that I'd actually seen my whole life. I'd seen my whole life the complexities and challenges of adoption, but I just hadn't realized it. And so I think the story that first stood out to me a lot was Astrid Castro. And because her story had so many parallels with my dad's experience, because hers was about international adoption as well.
Born in Colombia, adopted by a white couple in America as a child.
Yeah, so super similar to my dad's story, because he was born in Guatemala, adopted by an American white couple. So one of the things that really stood out to me was when she started talking about the language, not being able to speak Spanish, even though she obviously looked like maybe she could speak Spanish just based on stereotypes or whatever. And that was similar to what I've experienced in my life because, you know, I'm half Guatemalan, I'm half white, so I can pass for white super easily. So a lot of the times I never experienced people like my dad. People will walk up to him on the street and start speaking to him in Spanish. And he does speak Spanish, but he learned it later in life. It's not like it's his first language or anything. So that doesn't really happen to me, but oftentimes with like people that knew my dad, like I remember one time I was with my dad on a work trip, and at the time he was using a lot of Spanish in his job. He was working with a lot of people from Mexico as part of his job. And on that trip, a bunch of people would come up to me, his coworkers from Mexico, different clients from Mexico would come up to me and start speaking to me in Spanish. And I was 14 at the time, and I spoke no Spanish at all. And so I started feeling kind of embarrassed, like, I wish I knew Spanish, but I don't. Like, I know that's like what you expect me to do, but I don't. And so then that was always kind of challenging for me because I was like, well, but am I really like Guatemalan if I don't speak Spanish? But then when I was 19, I actually did learn Spanish, and that was super helpful to me in understanding my personal identity. And not that I think that's necessary for everyone to do, but it helped me connect to that part of myself. Yeah. And so I thought it was cool that she explained that as one of the repercussions of adoption. And that's not necessarily a bad thing, but it is a little uncomfortable sometimes. And I thought that really opened up my eyes to like thinking more deeply about the adoption issue of like, we need to be thinking deeply about these things because it really affects real people.
Yeah. Interesting that she put into words something that this must have been a kind of a cathartic moment or a real like, lean forward moment when this is Astrid Castro in the episode talking about the language and feeling disconnected from her culture because of her lack of ability to speak Spanish very well.
If it's somebody who looks like me, I instantly go into imposter syndrome. I instantly go to, I'm sorry, I wish, can you just hold on a second? I want to tell you my entire life story. I was adopted. It's not my fault. And I do value where I come from. And I do, wish that I spoke Spanish and I would speak to you in Spanish, all of that.
It sounds so much like what you were just describing.
Yep,
having lived
exactly.
that experience.
I always have to give a little explanation of when people ask me how I know Spanish, I'm like, well, my dad's Guatemalan, but he didn't learn Spanish till later in life, and I didn't learn Spanish till later in my life, so I'm not like a native speaker, but I do speak some Spanish. It's not perfect.
Yeah,
so.
I do have this, like ethnic heritage.
I always have to, it's always an explanation so people can understand.
Right. And so what, you were willing to kind of stay with the possibility that maybe it was more complex than you had been willing to admit. And over the course of sort of listening and working on this episode and hearing these perspectives, it sounds like you had some of your own personal realizations. You came to more clarity about your own experience. Did anything else come of it for you? Or in what ways are you sort of in hindsight glad that you stuck with it?
Yeah, I just feel like in general, as I've kept going with this job, kept working on different episodes, it's helped me realize that my experience doesn't necessarily have to be the experience that everyone else has. People have had negative experiences with adoption. People have super negative opinions towards it a lot of the time. And just because I don't feel that same way doesn't mean they're wrong, doesn't mean my experience is wrong or my family's experience is wrong. And so it's helped me as I've looked into other topics that are maybe personally applicable to my life, maybe not. I can see that, it's not about my experience necessarily. Not that my experience isn't valid, but it's about helping all perspectives be shown so that we can learn more about it and maybe in the process learn something about ourselves, because I think it's so easy to get locked in our own ways of, well, this was my experience, so this is how it is. Mm-hmm. But that's never going to help you progress. And so I think when I'm able to look deeper and put aside maybe the emotion that I have connected with it and analyze things a little deeper while still honoring the experiences that I have, I'm able to see other perspectives in a more empathetic way and learn a lot more than I could have maybe before.
Vanessa, thank you so much for sharing this with us today.
Of course. Thank you.
I'm Amber Mortensen. I'm from California. I've been working on Top of Mind for the last 6 months. My stick with it moment this season was on episode 3 on traffic stops.
What was the perspective that challenged you?
We had a guest on the podcast, Officer Mark Ross, and we were asking him questions about the disproportionate nature of, specifically getting pulled over in...
Why drivers of color are so much more likely to get pulled over.
Yeah, and his answer, when I heard it, just really ticked me off. It felt like a justification of the experience that disenfranchised people tend to go through when it comes to police presence and police action.
He talked about how a major reason that more drivers of color get pulled over is because there's more of a police presence in neighborhoods of color where more of the crime in the city is happening. And so, but for you, it felt like he was blaming people of color for the crime in their communities.
Yes. The answer as I heard it was like in a quiet way, it felt to me like it was endorsing the violence that happens, the police violence that does happen in disenfranchised low-income neighborhoods. And my response was that I wanted it cut from the episode. I come from the stance of if it ticks me off, it could very well hurt someone else.
Yeah. So you wanted it removed. You worried that it might upset or even hurt some listeners.
Yeah.
But it didn't get removed.
No.
And what happened as you continued to engage with this issue and chose to stay open and curious about his perspective rather than completely dismiss it out of hand as the episode production continued?
Yeah, it was definitely a internal grapple for me because I don't want to hurt people's feelings, but I'm also somewhat of a devil's advocate in my own mind. And so this felt like a situation where I was standing on the other side from the devil's advocate and shutting it down instead of listening. And I pride myself on being a fairly neutral thinker and accepting a new information very quickly. And then suddenly, for pretty much the first time in like forever, I was faced with something that I did not accept and that ticked me off, because when you're having an emotional response to something, you're not at your most logical. And that had an impact on me. And so I remember sitting at my workstation thinking, why was this left in? And I realized it was because that was the answer to the question that we asked. If we start sanitizing other people's viewpoints, then we are just another cog in the he said, she said, okay, but what's the actual quote machine that happens in news a lot? And if we had sliced and diced that from the episode, then in a way we are removing other people's ability to make a judgment on that. And that ticks me off when people do it to me. I do not like people telling me what to think about someone, but not letting me make my own judgment. And so I had made my judgment, but I was trying to, and I didn't realize that I was doing it until I was looking at the final script. I was trying to make a situation where everyone was going to think the way I thought. And that's not cool.
So how are you different as a result in terms of, interacting with or thinking about perspectives that you disagree with?
It's been different since, because I don't often find myself experiencing things like cognitive dissonance because I am very easy accepting with new information. But this was a big cognitive dissonance for me. And since then, because I've found the answer to it, which is people have a right to share their perspectives. And since I've come through the process of understanding feelings versus my logical side of that, I've been more aware of the fact that, as logical as I think myself to be, emotions do absolutely come into play. And when I'm doing work and I hear something a guest says that I disagree with, or even when I just encounter my sister disagreeing with me, I'm able to catch when emotions start overwhelming logic and understanding.
Yeah, emotions do have a way. I mean, that's the essence of a stick with it, right? Our gut reaction is all fueled by emotion. It's either discomfort or disgust or fear, and it's really, really hard to sort of press pause on those emotions and choose something else. Choose to stay uncomfortable. Choose to stay open and curious.
It was an exercise of a number of different principles I've learned throughout my life, but taping them all together and being able to look at what was frustrating me and why I had the just get rid of it childish reaction, and looking deeper than that as an adult. How can we have these conversations? And the answer is to take a chill pill on our feelings.
Amber, thank you so much for sharing this with us today.
It's an absolute pleasure.
That actually reminds me of a stick with it moment that I had working on episode 7. This is the one about the English language. Linguist Valerie Friedland basically told all of us who get worked up over language pet peeves to take a chill pill because
what we don't like is who's doing it. That's really what bothers us.
That really stung me. I had to acknowledge in that moment how judgmental I am about the way people talk, and how often I do that judging with a sense of righteousness because there's a right way and a wrong way to speak English, and I'm on the right side, so I have the right to judge. And then to hear Valerie Friedland list some of the words and pronunciations I insist on as proper English that were actually the exact opposite. They were considered bad English, not even 100 years ago. Well, it was humbling to realize that what's proper is so changeable and so rooted in bias. Since working on that episode, I am much more aware of how quick I am to judge people as they speak, and how hypocritical I am for doing that judging when I'm over here dropping the ly on the end of words and saying like so much more than I realize. So how about you? What is a perspective you've heard on Top of Mind that challenged you to think differently or just more deeply? Email topofmind@byu.edu. I'd love to hear it, and I promise not to judge your grammar. Okay, here's one last stick with it story from our team today.
I'm James Hoops. I'm from Minnesota, and I've been working for Top of Mind for about 2 years now.
It's great having you on the team. Which episode gave you a stick with it moment?
Yeah, so my stick with it moment actually came in a stick with it episode.
I love it.
Our episode with Utah Governor Spencer Cox.
Okay, so what was it about the conversation with Governor Cox that made you feel challenged?
Yeah, I mean, I guess my initial reaction was excitement because what a great get, right? But almost immediately after that, I felt really skeptical and on the verge of wanting to be dismissive almost because there was some policy decisions he had made that had frustrated me in the past few years, where he had signed off and approved some new congressional boundaries that many people have criticized for being gerrymandered. And so in my mind, I was like, what can this governor really teach me about sticking with it, when from my perspective, it seemed like he had quashed political opposition a little bit. I was pretty skeptical and ready to be really dismissive of him.
Right, especially when you probably you knew that one of the things we wanted to talk with the governor about was his Disagree Better initiative as the new chair of the National Governors Association. He just made this big splash with this, like, we need to learn how to disagree better. And so I imagine there was just an additional level of like, I mean, come on.
Yeah,
kind of.
I was like, this probably looks great for you, but when it comes down to it, what I've seen is, I don't know if you can really talk to this in a way that's going to be compelling to me.
Your instinct was to dismiss, maybe even like just not listen. to the episode.
I mean, part of me wanted to listen just to be like, oh, I was totally right about what Spencer Cox was bringing to the table and just sort of validate myself and my initial feelings. So I still listen to it maybe going in with that head, in that headspace with that frame of mind of being like, let's validate my feelings of dismissing Spencer Cox.
Yeah.
But that's not actually what ended up happening while I was listening. When he started presenting about his initiative with the governors around the country, I was actually really, really compelled by what he was saying and super surprised to find myself being like, oh, that's super sensible. I agree with everything he's saying, and I came in with this idea that everything he'd say was sort of going to be easy to dismiss, and I find myself agreeing with him on most of what he presented.
Yeah, well, let's listen to just a little bit. This is Utah Governor Spencer Cox in a conversation with us here on Top of Mind, a Stick With It conversation during season 4. And here he is talking about how he pitched his Disagree Better initiative to other governors, both Republicans and Democrats.
I actually had to convince them that it's not just about being nicer to each other, although that's certainly important. This is not just another civility initiative. There's actual science behind what we're doing. We've been working with researchers from major universities, Stanford's Policy Lab, Duke, Dartmouth, and this is really about disagreeing and how important disagreement actually is. Civility is usually focused on let's just get along and be unified. This is about disagreeing, but disagreeing in the right way. Healthy conflict versus the unhealthy conflict that we're seeing in our country that is tearing us apart.
This is a clip from Utah Governor Spencer Cox in conversation with me on a Stick With It episode of the Top of Mind podcast that you can find on our feed right now if you want to go listen to that entire conversation. He told a number of stories from his own experience as a politician disagreeing better and also falling short and having to make an apology and sort of commit to do better. So James Hoops, you went into this listening experience in this particular conversation the way I think a lot of us do when we see a politician either writing an op-ed or there's an interview or even reading their book, and you're like, I don't agree with this person. So, our walls are up. But something was different for you. Or what was that experience like when you sort of found yourself kind of agreeing with him? How did that feel?
Yeah, I mean, I guess it was a little bit humbling to have this experience of listening to him and finding myself agreeing with most of the things he was saying, because I realized I was being pretty deeply impragmatic when I was coming in with this headspace of I can't agree with this guy because of this one thing that he did, right? And that doesn't mean that I have to agree with the congressional districts or any of the other initiatives that he's doing outside of this, but refusing to acknowledge that, hey, there is some middle ground and common ground here with this politician that sometimes I disagree with, I think prevents us from moving the needle in positive directions no matter what the topic is or what the issue is.
So you find yourself seeing him in a slightly different light, but also thinking differently about how you engage with organizations, individuals
totally
you disagree with.
Yeah, I think being able to hold all parts of people and organizations, right? Being able to say, yeah, Spencer Cox has some really great insights on immigration or disagreeing better, and also saying maybe he doesn't have insights that I necessarily agree with on congressional districts or other issues like that. But recognizing that allows me to be able to say, hey, maybe I can engage on disagree better with Spencer Cox and we can move that in a positive direction. If I just dismiss him completely, I'm not able to do any good or make any positive change, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
James, thank you. Thanks so much for sharing that.
Yeah.
It's great having you on the team.
Thanks, Julie.
And thanks to you for tuning in today. We'd love to hear your thoughts on Season 4 of Top of Mind. Email topofmind@byu.edu or track us down on social media. We are at Top of Mind Pod. At least one of the episodes this season was directly inspired by listener feedback on social media. So let us know what you'd like to hear more of or less of. What questions did we leave unanswered? What topics do you want us to tackle? An Apple Podcast listener named LNLSB said this in a recent review on the app. This podcast is informative and thought-provoking. These are conversations we should have. If you agree, we would love to have you leave a review on Apple Podcasts too. And if you missed any of our episodes from Season 4, now's a great time to catch up. We're taking a short break for the holidays. Look for Season 5 starting in mid-January. Top of Mind is a BYU Radio production. Season 4 was produced by James Hoops, Samuel Benson, Elena Beck, Vanessa Goodman, Amber Mortensen, Abigail Tolley, Tyler Kapp, and me. We had sound design and audio engineering by Brendan Lewis, Spencer Hewitt, Kelsey Ney, Trent Reimschüssel, and Clark Jackman. I'm Julie Rose. We'll talk soon. Hey, Top of Mind listeners, Julie here. I just wanted to let you know about a special treat for you and your family. Starting December 1st, just in time for Advent season, our sister podcast, Constant Wonder, will be dropping a short daily episode with an inspiring Christmas theme. Might be a story from nature, art, or the Bible.
Because remember, in the story, the Magi were not Jewish. They were coming from the East, from different traditions. And yet they're being drawn together in this moment of worship. It kind of gives you that hope that maybe there would be this ability for us to cross all the things that divide us and worship and wonder together.
Each episode's only about 10 minutes long, making it easy to bring the Christmas spirit into your life throughout the holidays. So check out Constant Wonder starting December 1st on your favorite podcast platform or the BYU Radio app.